Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Emily Ritter from the University of California, Merced. I'm also the coordinator of the online speaker series for the Peace Science Colloquium, for the Peace Science Society International. And we're meeting today for the online Peace Science Colloquium. And today we're going to feature a paper from Howard Liu, who's a graduate student at Duke University. We're joined by excellent discussants today, Peter Lorentzen of the University of San Francisco, and Zachary Steinert-Threlkeld, who is at UCLA in the Policy School, right? Okay. And I will also be discussing today's paper. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Howard, who's going to present Elite Competition, Local Extraction, and Social Unrest, Understanding Mass Protest in Authoritarian Regimes. And I also want to take a moment to note that this paper is available on our website. So if you want to take a look yourself, you can go over to the website and check it out. And I'm sure Howard would love to have your feedback. You could email him directly. So with that, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me try to share my screen so everyone can see it. Great. So everyone can see it, right? I guess so. So first, I wanted to thank Emily for organizing this conference and allowing me to present this work. I very much appreciate it, and I also thank for my discussants to spend the time to read this paper. I'm still revising it, so I would definitely looking forward for feedbacks and comments for suggestions. So I think the motivation of this paper is that recent year in political science, we're seeing a growing interest in studying protest dynamics in authoritarian countries. And many of these papers are focusing on more of high-profile anti-regime protests. And this protest event is more of representing the anti-opposition movements or opposition parties. However, in authoritarian countries, there are also many protests that are more local and are a result of local indigenous grievances. The dynamics of these local and indigenous grievances might be different from those political resistance that's being widely studied. So I think it might be needing more research on this area. So this is particularly true in such a large authoritarian countries like China. There are many, many local protests ongoing, and also there shows great regional variation within a country. So it's worthwhile for us to kind of investigate in a way. The current literature that has been looking at the trying to understand protest can be kind of categorized in two directions. The first direction is kind of focusing on social economic dimensions, like focusing on land issues, environmental pollution, labor treatment, or taxation, etc. And another line of literature is kind of focusing on why government is permitting these protests. The argument is that this local protest is kind of used as a checkpoint for the central government to monitor the local agents' behavior so that it can monitor them and kind of restrict them from misbehavior. But what is missing for this kind of literature is the role of local politics, which is very important for me. And I feel like it could have been more extended in the literature. In terms of local politics, there's one key feature in Chinese local politics, which is elite promotion competition system, that the central government selectively promotes local elites among their peers. For example, like among the county leaders to city leaders, and city leaders among city leaders promote them to provincial leaders. And the promotion criteria is largely based on local economic and physical performance. So this promotion system created a strong incentive for these local elites to compete against each other, especially in economic area. There have been work that is studied in some adverse consequences, particularly on surging public expenditure, irregular taxation or fees, and also local government manipulating their GDPs. But what are less studies is the social consequences. What are other social effects that beyond the political consequences that's also worthwhile for investigation? So that's the focus of this. That's the purpose of this paper. So this paper argue that the political promotion system also can cast an influence on the social stability. That the promotion system motivate local elites to compete against each other in economic performance, and they create various type of policy instruments to grab local resources so that they can boost their economic performance, such like taxation, fees, and land extractions. And these extraction efforts often trigger local unrest. But there's another factor to consider. While leaders are motivated to compete against each other and extract resources, they also fear that protests can backfire on their career because protests could incur punishment, political punishment for these leaders and get them to be demoted. Some protests may be tolerable, as we see in some cases, but it also lead to increasing the cost of punishment to elite when they are looking for promotion prospects as it increase in the magnitude of protests. So in this paper, I propose a nonlinear relationship, an inverse U relationship to be specifically, that increased competition can yield more extraction and therefore more protest, but only to a point where the cost is no greater than the potential rewards. And in other words, when competition is highly intensified, competitive leaders is likely to back down because of fear that the rising cost that is overweighing their potential rewards. So they will back down from a race and extraction will decrease or level off. So essentially, this paper is examining the triad relation between competition, extraction, and social protest. And here I'm showing a brief example in order to demonstrate what's going on in terms of protests in China. For example, in 2010, in Jiangsu province, in Suzhou city, 1,000 villagers are gathering together to accuse government they are taking their lands and withholding their land compensation. And they clash with the riot police, suspecting that government is taking their money away and their private property has been damaged to make way for new buildings. So a brief reflection from this example is that Tong'an protest is just an incident, but it actually reflects a very severe land injustice situation in contemporary China. And these local governments, they are competing to grab lands and sell to outside investors so that they can boost their fiscal revenues. And there has been studies showing that in cities in this province, there are actually a comprehensive price depreciation against land selling. So land price originally was around like 200,000, but depreciated because competition to $80,000. So comprehensive competing in selling lands and grabbing lands triggered a lot of forced relocation and confiscation and also unfair compensation to these farmers. These are direct causes to these land grievances and protests. So quickly jumping to the empirical analysis. The unit of analysis here is province year panel data from 2001 to 2014. The dependent variable is aggregated from the massive local protest events collected from IQ's data. Some features that is beneficial for me to use this data is that these event reports are mostly from Hong Kong independent news resources. So kind of avoiding the bias by using the official media. And the second feature is that land extraction conflicts stand as the most frequent type that we see in many research. It's good for me to test on this extraction argument and mechanism. And finally, most of the protests are involving hundreds of people, and many are involving thousands of people. So these massive events are helpful for me to test on the collective action, massive collective action that was triggered by this comprehensive land grabbing and land taking. The main exploratory variable is intensity of competition between city leaders within province. The reason why I'm focusing on city leaders is that they are primarily responsible for authorizing these local attractions, especially on land conversion issues. And I also followed Liu and Landry, their 2014 APSR paper, by using their proxy for competition by using the number of local districts within an administration boundary as a proxy for competition. And in addition, also control for some variables like local land areas, GDP, population, urbanization, and public security expenditure, and also spatial lat. These are variables that can be also contributing to the occurrence of protests. Okay, and here's the main result. The city leaders representing competition variable. As you can see that there's a nonlinear relation between competition and protest. The first term on the competition is positive, and second term is negative, showing this nonlinear relations. And this result is robust by subsetting the data by only focusing on land protest, and also excluding other provinces that are more security prioritized, such as Tibet, Xinjiang, or Ningxia, these provinces. Okay. And in addition to the general association between competition and protest, I also investigate the mechanism, the potential mechanism, which is land grabbing, land expropriation, and protest. In the left-hand panel, I show that land grabs, land granting accounts is positively associated with land protest. And after adding this land grabbing counts variable, the main effect between competition and protest is moderated, meaning that there's a mediating effect going on here. And the right-hand panel is showing that there's also a nonlinear relation between competition and land grabbing. So it's a triadic relation between competition to land grabs and land grabs to land protests. Okay. And in addition to the regression, I also conduct a out-of-sample predictions, kind of try to evaluate the predictive power of the main variable, which is evaluated in the in-sample. In the first two panel, it was a competition model, which includes a competition variable and also other control variables. The bottom two panels is not having the competition, only with the control variables. And you can see that the prediction is better with this variable. The rooming square error is smaller compared to the baseline model. And the panel show that the predicted counts hits more on the actual counts from the first two panel compared to the last two panel. Okay. So this is a additional analysis on prediction. So quickly jump into concluding remarks. This paper explores the institutional impact on social unrest, which is a dimension that was previously last studied in contentious politics literature. And also it brings together the study of authoritarian institution and the contentious politics together, which are largely separated in two different literature. And I combine them together to help us to understand protest dynamics in authoritarian countries. And finally, this paper and findings suggest that maybe we can pay more attention to different type of local protests, such as labor protests or land protests or environmental protests, to help us better understand the mechanism and the channel by which the authoritarian institution could be influencing the pattern of the social resistance. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to open it up to our discussants. Who'd like to go first? Zach.
Yeah, I'll start. So let me center this window. Okay. So I mean, first off, Howard, I think congratulations on what's a strong start. I don't want to say start to a paper. You've already done a lot of work, but this is clearly it's really interesting. You've done a lot of work, and I think you're pretty close to having it in publishable form. It's also a really nice merger of machine-coded events data with what's clearly subject matter expertise, and then other data to get at some really nice subnational variation, which you're right, we often don't have in the conflict literature. I guess my first comments are just trying to understand the mechanisms better, both theoretically and then how they're then operationalized in the model. First, I would like to see just more discussion about land ownership in China, because I'm of two minds, not being an expert. One, just my naive belief would be that the land is socialized and individuals don't have property rights in the first place. Even if that is the case, in fact, that's clearly not how people believe, because they're protesting over this. But that I would still kind of be surprised that there's this strong belief in the right to the land. On the other hand, kind of my previous exposure to local land extraction was all about these, I guess, nail houses they're called, but homeowners who do not sell to the local government. And so, you have the home surrounded by a road or the home surrounded by the large apartment buildings. And so it seems like there is the ability to resist local governments, but your paper is framed as a complete inability to do so, right? Because it's extraction, they're seizing your assets, maybe not appropriate, not giving you the appropriations that you would expect. But from reading the New York Times or the Guardian, whatever, it seems like people can refuse to sell. So I just don't quite understand why sometimes that happens and sometimes that doesn't.
Can I follow up on that really quickly, which is that I also don't understand how this works. And that's, I would push you to try and be clear on this, just because I feel like the argument that you're making is not China specific necessarily. And so I'm interested in how it can be applied elsewhere, but in particular, so on the land question is, so your competition variable doesn't vary across time very much. Right. But I don't understand if land expropriation does vary over time. So is it that, like, once the local leaders have taken all of the land, then is it that, can it be then taken by the next leader, or is it, so if they're turning over in their particular prefectures, are there particular cities, does land expropriation change? You see what I mean? So is it once the peasant or the civilian had their land stolen and it's sold to somebody, is that land then available for being expropriated again in the future? Or is it done? Like that land is
it's more likely to be done.
Okay.
It's being extracted. So can I respond?
Yeah, please respond to
okay.
these points.
So yeah, it's definitely a temporal variation in terms of land grabbing, right? So the previous official can sign a contract to extract land, and most of the time, these residents just didn't know, and they are just notified that we're going to extract your land, and we'll give you money. So don't be angry about it. And then there's okay, you didn't notify us, it's okay, but we're expecting compensation. And then after years and years, the compensation is not coming. They're just angry again, and then they go to protest. So that's definitely there are definitely temporal variation, but it's not explained by the competition variable because it's like mostly very cross-sectional. So it's not being able to capture it. That's definitely correct.
Okay.
And
did you want to finish it? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, Zach, do you have more comments? I can wait until you're finished.
I think I cut you off, and you wanted to make some more.
Well, then my next comment is just about your DV. So if we want, we can continue the land conversation right now.
Okay.
Okay. So there are many nail houses incidents that was exposed to news media. That's definitely true. And but nail house, this individual incidents is not directly associated with mass protests, because this individual can be buy off or just can be addressed in different ways. But I think this paper is trying to focus on the massive land grabs that associate with many households, like 1,000 households. Mm-hmm. So these are massive land grabs, most of the time associated with government wanting to build industrial parks or commercial housing, so they need a massive amount of lands. And so they're involving many people. The grievance is hardly to be addressed by attacking individual by the government to be addressed. So this is a massive land taking causing collective actions, not necessarily focusing on narrow household, but that's definitely a different individual cases over there. Mm-hmm. Right. So these people in trying to use protests as a mechanism to vent their anger and try to claim their right. So it's not that they don't have the ability, protest their ability to show that we are not satisfied to the government. So mm-hmm. to go to the public so government cannot cover it up. Mm-hmm. So in China, because the legal system is kind of ineffective in a way, so people alternatively will go to street, going to the street protest as a mechanism to mm-hmm. claim their rights. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you keep using the word massive, and to be honest, I don't remember you using that adjective in the paper, but I'm curious why you use it, if it's because there's some threshold effect to be included in IQs, and so any protest you're calling massive, or have you filtered the data that IQs identifies as protests for only those that are massive? And if that's what you've done, how do you define massive?
Right. So the reason why I reframe it into more massive kind of term, first is that by some suggestion by people, I re-look at the data, and because I am able to access to the raw text, mm-hmm. but actually I read through all these events.
Okay.
And I find that actually IQs didn't code the population, like participants, but I coded them. And most of the events involved are more massive, like involving hundreds of people or thousands of people. Mm-hmm. So more smaller scale events wasn't being included in IQs. That's understandable because in China, this instance is more easily to be covered up.
Right.
Right. And also, I also study protests in other countries. I feel that's also the case. Like when I was looking at Egypt protests, sorry to digress a little bit, but mm-hmm. I think it might be of interest for people. That IQ is also mainly capturing the major, larger scale events, but omitting the more local events.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to differentiate, trying to clear the boundary, the boundary of the paper of the claim is focusing on massive protests and not necessarily to the more small scale single events or a self-immolation or other type of more isolated events.
But if it's a protest over land expropriation,
yeah,
why does it matter whether the expropriation protest is small or large?
Before you answer that, Peter's got two fingers on this.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that I felt like the terminology massive sort of I think is misleading, or it leads native English speakers in a certain direction, which probably is not really necessary. I think you're just saying large scale just to acknowledge that because there's been leaked government statistics, just national level statistics, so no one actually knows what's underlying them. Talking about 130,000 protests a year, and so the point is he's just got a tiny fraction of this. What's being omitted? Well, the thing is, these protests they're talking about might be a street scuffle with 5 people and a police officer, or any number of other things, or even 2 gangs getting in a battle would also count, I think, as a mass incident of this nature. So I think maybe the term large scale would get more clearly at what you're saying, and it's really just saying you're looking at, there's a lot of disruption that happens, on a daily basis in any country, and you're looking at stuff that reaches a certain scale. Although it sounds like you don't have a precise cutoff, because part of it is just it reaches this scale that kind of reaches the news media, and that generally is 100 plus, but it's not exactly clear.
Yeah, so Peter's point is definitely clearer than mine. Yeah, larger scale might be the right term than using massive. That might be very misleading. Yeah, that's a good advice. Thanks so much. And also, a quick response to the land ownership. Zach had this question. So in China, farmers, these land users, they do not have the ownership, but though they have the usage right, so they can still use it and still to operate things on it. So whenever government try to nationalize it or confiscate it, they have to compensate it. Right? So it's still not necessarily owning it, but still they can use it. If you want to take the land out of it, you have to have a justification or give me something back. That's a system right now in China.
Yeah.
And just a key thing that is, a driver of these conflicts is that a lot of the compensation is based on it's both land taking and rezoning. So basically, it's zoned as agricultural, which is very low productivity and does not generate much revenue. And the payoff is based on that agricultural productivity, and then it can get rezoned as commercial or industrial and be worth 1,000 times as much. And so often the grievance might not be with it violation of the letter of the law of how much they were supposed to be compensated based on this low agricultural value, but them knowing there's this much money being made off of it, and maybe I think the local guy is, skimming off his own part, and at any rate, I deserve a cut of that. So it's not necessarily a legalistic. I think it's more often a sort of moral outrage at how much I didn't get of the money that they know or imagine there to be available.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay. Could you talk about why you aggregate to the province year instead of province month? Because my main concern is whether land expropriation could be a response to protest, like a punishment. I suspect it isn't, but I still wonder if and maybe right. So not a response to expropriation protests, but just a coercive state measure to punish people for bad behavior. And by aggregating to the year level, you might miss that temporal dynamic.
Right. So it kind of relates to Emily's previous question. So first, these events are coded in terms of date, so I definitely can reaggregate into monthly level. But theoretically, it might not be that clear how would the competition be responded within a certain, within a month. So government, they can have this, so government's behavior does not have a clear temporal kind of boundary in terms of affecting this protest. So I wasn't sure what's the value of saying that disaggregate into monthly level.
So what I mean is suppose that I'm an artist and I've made some contentious cartoons or paintings or whatever. Would the government then respond by seizing my family's farm, and could that lead to or so that wouldn't get the mechanism I'm talking about. But what if there are large protests about police brutality, and in response land is expropriated to punish the protesters? Does that ever happen? Because in that case, if you aggregate to the year, you might find that what looks like protests about land expropriation, you would think they're protests about land expropriation, but really they're protests about something else, and then land expropriation occurs. But because you're at a year level, you wouldn't necessarily see that temporal dynamic. But maybe land expropriation is never used that way, and this is just something that if you know the area like you do, you would never need to measure.
Can I just clarify? So you're not measuring land expropriation, right?
In my mechanism part, that is measuring that.
Okay, but in your main models where you're saying competition affects protest,
right?
There's no land expropriation in the middle, right?
Yeah.
So he's not accounting for that variation over time in the main models anyway, right? He's only correlating or connecting competition to protest.
But they're land expropriation protests, right?
Right.
So that presumably there is some land expropriation that occurred.
But certainly doesn't that mean that would counter your concern, right? So if you're saying that the land expropriation is happening after the protest, if he's only looking at land expropriation protests, then it can't be in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah, I think that because you've looked at the specific cases, right? So I think you're saying that the stated purpose of, is it of all the protests in your sample, is the stated purpose always regarding land expropriation? Or is it unclear in some cases what the motivation for the protest was?
It's definitely anti-government, but it's unclear. So as you know, land expropriation can be operated by many different levels of governments. So in the data, in the scripts, it often says it's anti-government, but not necessarily that it's against the state. But it's definitely against government or local governments.
Okay, so in that sense, it's at least like theoretically possible that Zachary's point would be there. I think speaking as someone familiar with literature and just the news media and everything, I don't think I've ever heard of. I've never heard of land expropriation being used as a punishment for a protesting group. Usually, it's really about it's a development plan. It's not just done to harm people.
Okay.
Right.
I'd like to take it to theory, but I also want to give Peter a chance to just.
I guess my main thing, well, actually, sort of was the flip side of it. I was surprised to ask you to hear, although I understand why now, why Zachary was asking about going to the month level, because I was, because as you said, most of this is cross-sectional. So like using, so I get why you would avoid fixed effects, but even the random effects, I mean, it's periodically every. I mean, I don't know. How often in your sample is there even any time series variation in the number of officials in a province? So they basically has to be that they've reorganized, reapportioned, and like created a new prefecture or merged some prefectures, things like that. I think that's pretty rare. So that's why you wouldn't get almost anything from fixed effects. But by that same token, then is random effects actually picking up, because you're getting kind of a huge. I think unless my stats is wrong on this, I feel like you're getting a huge boost in your sample size by having random effects. So then all of a sudden you can say it's 370 observations or whatever it was instead of 30. But I feel like the bulk of what's happening here is just you have some places, you have 30 provinces with basically the same number of officials in them over time, and it's that between province variation is the main thing. But then I worry that if you got down to if you do a cross section, then you're going to you just have a very tiny sample. But I wonder if implicitly, actually, you do only have a very tiny sample. That's, I think, my main empirical concern with this.
Right. So on this part, it's definitely a good point, and I thought about it before. That's the reason why in my appendix, I use a modified random effect to separate the within variation, because random effect is kind of capturing within variation and also across variations, kind of lumping them together. And as you're concerned before, like maybe you're mainly just how to differentiate that will be worthwhile for people to see. So I used a PSRIM 2015 model by Jones and someone, so that I separate the across variation and also the within variation, and show that the results mainly driven by the across variation in my appendix.
Yeah, so if it is a cross variation, I mean, so this is, I think, out of my methodology depth, but I just worry that to some extent, it's not really 300 observations, it's more like 30. Because it's not really repeated, draws of a new thing, even with autocorrelation. It's really one province that works a certain way, and it's not 10 observations of that problem. It's that province and it's kind of ongoing dynamics there and ongoing incentives faced by all officials in that province. Over, if we just average it over 14 years instead, do people there tend to push the limits and therefore get more protests? I feel like that cross-sectional question is what you're asking, and so I'm not sure where and I don't know the subtleties of like the different versions of random effects and everything, but okay. That's a concern I have.
So I had the same concern, which is that you're essentially showing us cross-sectional variation here of average protesting, of the effects of competition on the average protest levels across these 14 years. And that's not strictly what you're doing, but it's essentially what you're doing, right? Because there's a little variation there and you're not capturing land expropriation variation. I didn't see time controls. And so it could be that like if what you're saying is true about land being expropriated over time, or not being, like, tensions building over time because it's expropriated and then they're not compensated and not compensated, then maybe you could capture that with some time controls that you would multiply by the competition variable. That might give you a little bit more variation, but essentially, I think it's totally fine that you're making a cross-sectional analysis, but you need to be very upfront about that, that you're not actually predicting onset of protest. You're predicting average levels or average propensity for protest, because you're not capturing the thing that makes protest happen in a given year.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah. So my thoughts about theory were kind of related to these, which is that, so I think you're making some really cool claims here. I think you're, I really like this focus on competition and how, right, so the way I tend to think about it in my literature is that the government represses and then the people protest and then the government represses again, right? And it's not, I've not been thinking so hard about what about the government makes them repress. Like, what is it that there are elements or characteristics of the government that make them do that? And so I like this competition idea to think about why repression would happen or why these grievances would occur. So I think that this is a really cool thing. My instinct, I mean, if you had to guess what I was going to say, I would be like, what are the strategic elements here that you're not capturing? And so I wanted to know, so there are essentially 4 stages of your theory. There's competition among local leaders. And in places where there's more competition, there's going to be more land expropriation. That means that there's going to be more civilians affected or higher levels of grievance. And then there's going to be more protest, right? I mean, obviously there's the curvilinear prediction, but essentially you're saying that, right? Competition leads to expropriation, leads to grievance, leads to protest. And I felt like I had questions kind of at every point. And so my biggest ones were, I don't understand what this competition looks like, right? So if there's a province and there are, I don't know, 12 city leaders within this province, or 12 prefectures, or whatever the case may be, is it that when they're choosing a leader for the province level, is it that they're going to choose only one from each? Right? Is it that they could choose 2 leaders from this prefecture and none from this one? Are they always competing with one another? Is it that they could choose a province leader that's from a totally different province because they're really great at what they do? Are you actually only competing with the people at this level, or are you competing with people from other levels as well? So is there actually a lot more or less competition? I don't understand exactly how what the competition looks like.
Yeah, so it lets me feel that I'm still not doing a good job explaining all this detail. I should probably explain more, the better, so that the reader can understand.
At least the reader doesn't do any kind of, right?
So
yeah, I mean, a lot of this is familiar territory in recent Chinese politics work, but I agree that I think it's kind of, I guess then now that I mentioned it, like I read through that really quickly in your paper, but like
you're like, oh, I got that. I got that.
Not knowing this stuff, it's like, why is this justifiable? How does this all work? Yeah.
Right. It's definitely about that. So in general, in Chinese situation is that local leaders, when they are selected, especially on county and city, these leaders, for example, when they are selecting county, so there are also another 2 factors. It's a party leader or a state leader. Like state leader is this like city mayor, and party leader is like the party secretary. And when they are picking city party secretary and city mayor in province A, candidate will not likely, just most likely will not come from another place. It will be selected within the district, so from the counties. right? So it's a dynamic that's in the local level, but when you upgrade it into provincial level, that's different. So provincial levels, officials, they are mostly associated with CCP. So when they are like promoting people in the CCP, they can select from different provinces. So in terms of local level, like from between city leaders and between county leaders, they were selected within the boundary, not across.
Okay. So and then, if I'm the leader of a prefecture and you're a leader of a prefecture
in the same province,
I'm competing against you for the next level up position. But the only thing that I can do is take action within my prefecture.
Right.
So I can't expropriate land from your side. I can only expropriate land.
You have no rights. You have no rights to claim that I want to extract that land for my purpose. You are only responsible for your own district.
Okay.
Right. And also the upper level positions, for example, like provincial leaders, the number of seats are set, right? There are only one party secretary and one CT level leader. So the upper level positions are fixed, and these people, like 12 city leaders, as you said, are competing each other for these 2 seats.
Right.
So that's the reason why Louis Landry, they're using this idea, like the pool size of competitor to measure the intensity of competition.
Okay. Yeah. So why is it that, and anybody should feel free to interrupt me because I'm just going to keep asking questions. But so why is it that land expropriation is the dominant strategy? So if I'm competing against 12 other prefecture leaders for the next job, for those 2 positions at the province level, why is it that I should assume that competition leads to land expropriation? Why isn't it that competition leads to something else that isn't going to make people protest so much?
Right. I think this historical process, I kind of explained it in the theory section. We're probably, again, not doing well. So these local governments, they're responsible for collecting their own money. The central government is delegating this responsibility to these local level leaders. So they had to collect their own money to support their district expenses. So historically, like in the 1990s, local government, they're just trying to come up with different category of taxation. Right, they tax more people in some areas so that they can get fiscal revenues. But in mid of 1990 or 80, this action was banned. Said that you local leaders are extracting too many money from people, and people are protesting. You cannot do it no more. And people say, okay, if we cannot tax, what can we do to boost our fiscal revenue? Then they targeted on land. Right. Because land is a place, so as Zach was saying, it was a national property, right? But they can extract them and sell this land to investor. So they will give them money. So they will have performance boost. So that is actually in the paper, right? I get that. Right. But why is it that money is the driver for performance, right? So why is it that I would choose a leader who makes more money? Is that strictly the case that I'm going to choose the 2 leaders that made the most money in this province? Or is it that I'm going to choose a leader who has other great leadership qualities, is very loyal to the party, is more or less corrupt, right? There might be other aspects of the leaders that makes me want to point them. And I don't feel like you're conditioning on that. But I could be entirely wrong about the way the system works. But if that's the case, if that's the way leaders are chosen, then that limits the scope condition of how we can apply your competition argument, right? Right. So if it's only about competition for resources, then it needs to only be applied to countries where they're competing over these kinds of resources. Right. So in China, it's peculiar because there's no official documentation, official book about how we promote local leaders. People are trying to use different way to guess the myth of how these local elites are promoted. So I think there are like two major theories right now. So one theory that was published by Xi et al. Like in 2014 or something, saying that faction matters, right? Who are you allied with will matter how much likely you will get promoted. And another theory is about economic performance, which is like largely studied, saying that if you get more money in your district, showing that you are capable of being a good leader, then you got more potential, then we will reward you with a promotion. And there recently some Pierre Landry is saying that, well, we acknowledge that these two theories are both right, but they are working in different ladder. For the faction, it works more in CCP, in Central Party, when they're competing with the position with the central government, the CCP. But the performance model more often in local level, like the cities and counties. So if we are thinking about applying this situation in other countries, we need to think about the mechanisms. Right. So like, are they considering about money, or they're considering about social ties? Right. So this paper is focusing on local level, so it's focusing on the economic kind of perspective.
So it does kind of link into, and I guess that's an interesting question comparatively. So maybe, Howard, you're working on this. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what you get there too, because China does have this sort of unique thing where it's, the one way I think of it is it's like a giant corporation, right? You want to advance within the corporation, and so you're competing against other people at your level to look good by the standards of the corporation. So it's different from a lot of political settings we have. Even in a lot of authoritarian political settings, will have some kind of competition, but often it's competition to maybe kleptocratic competition, just to extract the most and pass rents on up to the top leader, or maybe it's electoral competition, like who can either beat or cajole the most number of kind of fake or somewhat coerced votes out of people to win elections and make the regime look strong. And neither of those is going on here, but it might be that there'd be you could maybe imagine, or I don't know, I'm just guessing, and imagine seeing some other kinds of competition. Like how do you get ahead within the authoritarian system, and how does that degree of competition change in different contexts, and what incentives does that create? I think that's the question here, and I'd be curious to see how that applies in other settings.
Yeah, that's really good. So it would be, if competition creates incentives to violate their rights or repress civilians in one way or another, it doesn't have to be that you steal their land, but that you beat them up on the way to voting or whatever the case may be, then we might still see this connection between competition, grievance, and protest, right? So it just may be that it's applied slightly differently than the particular case of China. Right.
So in previous version of this paper, I guess, because like when I was writing this paper, I will get backlash if this paper is sent to China scholars. China scholar is seeing this in different perspectives, saying that it's very special for China case. But if we think it's a different way, so like I would suggest to look at a paper written by Robertson about Russian protest. It's kind of similar in a way that this provincial leader, they are competing each other for getting resources from the central government. And they are using protest as a way to support their clan, saying that the labor unions in my district, they need money, right? So using these people in the street to get back up their claim to the central government that they want resources. So it's a different connection. It's not about money, it's not about promotion, but also about competition among these leaders and using protesters as their bargain. So I think for me, it's a very interesting to apply this general framework in different contexts. Yeah, but like from China scholar might see in different ways, and it's a very China specific. So I have difficulty about framing the paper. To be honest.
Yeah, I mean, Howard, I faced the same issue with my Arab Spring paper. And so I in the theory section, I think I then had a subsection that was like scope conditions, where I kind of addressed this. Because at some point you're not going to satisfy the China people and the generalists like Emily and I, the people who aren't area specialists. and that's where like the randomness and the peer review pool is gonna determine your fate. But by adding these like theoretical scope conditions, I think that's about as good as you can do.
Okay.
And then that lets you say you're telling not a China story, but you're telling an authoritarian protest story.
Mm-hmm.
China, that's what you focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying you're getting more of the China people are telling you this is just a China story, as opposed to the other people who are more open to it being generalizable. Because usually it goes the other way around. But I think
yeah.
But I can see some people now increasingly we are going in that direction, and maybe I can see that critique coming up.
Yeah, so because that, I cut the generation part in my conclusion because it was being attacked too often. That is a China-specific phenomenon about promotion. It's not possible to see it in other countries. So I cut that part.
That's so funny because obviously I wouldn't see it that way. I see it as applicable in lots of places. You just have to be specific.
Right. But maybe it's because of my writing that lead people to think that way. So one question I would definitely appreciate a response is that how to frame this paper better. Because when I pitch it, I want to pitch it to conflict research, but not China scholar paper.
I was convinced. So I don't know if Zach, if you have thoughts about this, or I mean, Peter, you probably struggle with this all the time, whether to pitch to area specialists.
Well, I thought the title was great. I mean, the title's not about China at all.
Mm-hmm.
The title is super general, and then you quickly make it clear in the intro that it's about China. I think you would need to have some discussion in maybe over a couple paragraphs about what elite competition looks like in other countries. So it sounds like you know that a little bit about Russia, which I don't. Frankly, I don't know what elite competition looks like in most countries outside of kind of what I studied there in spring. So anyway, the point is like I think maybe it's just going to require a little more qualitative digging and work on your part just to discuss how this competition varies and then how that's going to affect your mechanism, which may not be land seizure in every country. It's like but it's really GDP growth or maximizing whatever the objective performance criterion is, and then figuring out what those negative downstream effects are. So that if you were writing this paper in Russia, it might not be about land protests. It might be about I don't know, natural resource protests, something like that. But it's the same underlying mechanism.
I would also, if you're trying to, I would selectively cite. I would be more careful in the way that you're citing, what you're citing, because the vast majority of the stuff in your bibliography is about China. So that is where they pull their reviewer pools. Is that they look at who you're citing first, who you're citing most often, who you're citing and engaging directly, and it's almost entirely Chinese scholars. And so you're going to get a bunch of Chinese scholars when you, as your reviewers, even if you send it to the APSR. So you could cite work that's more generalists, either about authoritarian politics or about repression and dissent, and that might also help not just the frame, but it would also help the reviewer pool if that's what you're trying to do, is hit a generalist audience.
So like in the first paragraph of my introduction, kind of trying to connect with non-violent resistant kind of literature campaign. And I was being critiqued on that too. But maybe I can extend it in a way that's better connect to the protests in authoritarian countries, that kind of literature. So it goes to more conflict scholars.
Yeah. And you should also recommend them when you send it in for review.
Okay.
Recommend particular reviewers.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the introduction was very good.
I thought it was too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if there's, I mean, I guess part of it is almost where I see your study as being new and generalizable. Like a lot of the China people, we've been pointing out this issue that sort of not all protests are aimed at overthrow. It's not always the Arab Spring, right? There's little protests about little stuff, just like there is in democracies. Like, we don't want this development to go in, so the local community gets together. And we're not, personally, I'm kind of getting like down on the whole idea of calling that resistance, because often it's very much it's acknowledging the rules of the game. It's not like trying to overthrow anything or resist the state. It's just saying we want to kick out one local leader and get the stuff we want, or we just want a better payoff. It's not resisting. It's more, it's like a union isn't resisting management when it bargains for better wages. It's just having a bargain. It's just bargaining. But that's a little personal idiosyncrasy of it. Like, but a lot of the China people, one way or another, are talking about these kinds of small scale protests. There's been a lot written about that. So your contribution's less there. So in a sense, maybe your first and second paragraph do lead to more of an established literature of what China people has said that is different from what other people are saying. But then so maybe I wonder if you can link it more to this issue of competition among the sub-elite level. I mean, because that's actually what it is. It's not just the elites, that kind of factional stuff and like who's on top and alliances, hardliners, softliners, right? That goes back a long way. But like, what in other countries is the game to get ahead for people who just want to get ahead within the ruling system? And if there's maybe some literature you could bring in on that, even just that qualitatively illustrates that actually, I don't know, how did you rise up in Saddam's Iraq, or how did you rise up, or now how do you rise up in Egypt, or in these other countries where like the elections are not the main thing, or maybe they are, but if they're elections, again, like I mentioned, like you could see, I was trying to think like where you'd see something like this, where the degree of competition would matter, especially linked with human rights. Like I could see like repressive human rights violations. Maybe you'd find a similar dynamic where places where there's a dominant party, maybe from an ethnic group, where like 90% of the people are from the dominant party. You don't have to repress anyone because they're just in charge. And in the localities where 10% of the people are from the dominant party and they just know they're going to lose, like unless they just kill everyone, they also don't bother to repress. You might see only places where like we can turn this, this election if we just put pressure on the right people at the right time. Anyway, I don't know what the right example is. That's just one I'm making up that could be totally off base, but you might see those dynamics elsewhere. And emphasizing this in the context of this, like you said, institutional thing of like, how do you advance within an authoritarian regime, advance your career, the careerism part, and how that connects to conflict, I think would be fresh. And if you phrase it right, without saying you've shown how it works everywhere, because of course you haven't, you've just shown in one case. But then I think the China people would get like, oh, okay, maybe it is, China's unique in so many ways, but I get that it relates elsewhere, and the other scholars, of course, would be interested as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And it's possible that you might need to reframe. I wouldn't do this yet. I would try sending it out a couple of times first, but you might need to reframe your whole theory in that the ideas are all the same, but most of the way you talk about it is about Chinese advancement and land expropriation and the promotion system in China. So you're applying your case throughout the entire theory section instead of writing a theory about how competition affects protest and then applying it to the China case.
Okay.
Right? So that's a lot of work, and that is a lot of change to what you've got. I would not try that first, but if you really need to hit a generalist audience, which obviously you're a grad student and may need to do that, then you might need to think about how to reframe your theory entirely. But again, don't do that first.
Yeah.
I had one more concern that, of course, I think is big, and maybe nobody else thinks it's big, but that's kind of how critiques work. But, is that you assume pretty explicitly that grievance leads to protest. And it's not really how we tend to think about it anymore, especially when we're talking about mass protests. If we're talking about hundreds of people, there's got to be something that's organizational involved. There's got to be something that is, I mean, are they acting in expectation of what repression would look like? Is it dependent on their security forces? Does it depend on their ethnic group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Like, even massive land grabs aren't necessarily going to trigger a protest. And so especially as you try to extend these to other cases or think about how some sort of rights violation in the process of competition is going to lead to protest, I would want to see more of the mechanism between grievance and protest, right? So how is it that we actually get there? And I think it matters less if you're doing this cross-sectionally. So the fact that you're measuring, that you're essentially comparing province to province instead of provinces over time, you're not actually measuring the triggering. And so I think that maybe empirically you're getting around my concern in that you're saying an overall grievance level affects the overall propensity for us to see this latent propensity to see protest. But if you try to do this temporally and predict protests over time, or look at a place that the violations are connected to temporal things like elections, then you're going to need to figure out what this mechanism is that connects the grievance to the protest and how it's strategic or unstrategic, right? Zach has two fingers.
Yeah, so, you know, one thing we know about how grievances can lead to protests is that there's like a learning-based mechanism, right? And so you see large-scale protests somewhere else, maybe you see a resulting concession, and that lets you update your priors on your probability of success, and therefore you get this large protest. And so that's a way of saying that you may want to consider spatial controls for large-scale protests in nearby provinces, but ideally, like, you know, cities.
You do have a bit of a spatial thing, right?
I saw there was a spatial, yeah. So I mean, I saw that flipping through here again, but I wasn't able to read the words. So maybe you did do that.
But at the same time, this does get directly at the mechanism concern.
But there also could be a temporal lag as well, right? That as you learned that the previous year's protests led to increased compensation or decreased expropriation, that could lead to more protests in the next years as well. And I don't believe you lagged protests. At least I couldn't. Again, when I was thinking back at the charts, I couldn't see that. And that could just be because it's the font's small. So maybe you did do that. But if you didn't, I would consider doing that.
Right, I did it before, but I got some suggestions saying that you don't want to have a lag DV in your random effect model because it will mess things up.
Well, that's probably true.
Yeah, right. So that could be it.
Yeah, but I can do it in another regression, which is using clusters and error. That won't be.
Yeah, I think one of your appendix regressions, you don't use a random effects model, right?
Right. Because some people want to see adding in different variables.
Yeah.
But that told me that I wasn't connecting the theory of this control variable better. So I was adding this variable, but not necessarily using them to explain a mechanism that may be underlying to explain protest dynamics.
Right.
So I think that's something I should do better, like using protest lag or spatial lag. Yeah, and also using the police as a expectation.
Yeah.
Right. So like it's pretty critical that in an authoritarian regime, right, that's particularly a repressive regime, that a person or a group of people or a whole bunch of people not connected organizationally have to expect that it's going to lead to some sort of success, right? Like they're not going to just protest because they're angry like we do in the United States, right? We're going to protest if we think it's going to actually get something and we're not going to die. And that's not something that you're really capturing just yet. And so even if you don't have to take care of it in the empirical side, I want to see some theoretical development about what this looks like.
Yeah.
So
that's definitely right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and if you need to provide justification for including like temporal lags, I would start with Kurt Whalen's work on diffusion of revolutionary protests. And if he doesn't quite give you what you need, then people who cite him would.
Okay.
Weyland.
mm-hmm.
Wayland.
Yeah.
Cool.
I have some questions about your main model. So you use random effects negative binomial, right?
Right.
Yeah. I would like to know just how over dispersed the protests are to justify the negative binomial, to justify a more complex model. I mean, it seems to me like so if you have 725 events over 13 years, and I think it was maybe like 30 protests. Anyway, I would be surprised if your data are very over dispersed. And so I wonder if just OLS or log DB, OLS on a log DB would get you there. And then you could do well, I was going to say you could do lag DB, but you still couldn't. Anyway, the point is simply I would want to see justification for a more complex model before you use it.
Okay, like why I'm using random effect negative binomial.
Why you're using negative binomial? Random effects is fine. Why are you using negative binomial?
My thinking is that whenever you have a count DV, right, negative binomial is better than using Poisson because it have an over dispersion effect that you're saying.
If you have over dispersion, so Zach wants to see if you do or you don't.
Oh, right. I see.
I want to see. Yeah, and I mean that could like. I mean, you could show me a histogram in the appendix. You could tell me the mean versus the median. But it's generally better to stick with OLS when you can. And I mean, I noticed in one of the appendix, one of the results in the appendix, it looked like you did do that. I forget which specific one. And then I also appendix H, linear model with clustered standard errors and fixed effect. Yeah. So I mean, maybe you did that, and then my preference would be that that's your main result, and then you have robustness checks using negative binomials. That's just my opinion.
Okay. You maybe just have all possible different models to justify that the results is there.
Like how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah. I would do that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're about out of time, but I wanted to see if Peter had any more questions or comments you wanted to add.
I think just the last thing that I had on my list is I would like to see a little bit more, or get more of a sense of what is the magnitude of this, like, because you sort of pitch it as like now we're looking at subnational variation, but in a sense, like, I don't know how much the subnational variation actually you're predicting. Is this some like, do you have just a little increment, which is fine, like that if you're testing a theory and you have some little increment of effect in the right direction, that's good. But then if you then want to go on and say, now we know what, a major driver, like, is this a major driver, or we just see that, like, okay, we see it has some effect, or what? I think it'd be good to kind of, get some kind of scale on that, just to put the whole thing in context.
Okay, I was using a map to show the spatial distribution. So maybe have a table or something would be better, helping to see the subnational variation. I was having a map and with the protest as dots.
Right. But I'm wondering how much of the predicted, like how much of your prediction.
Oh, I see.
Like, prediction. Like in the, in the dumb old way of like saying, how much of the R squared are you capturing? I mean, I don't want you to just do that, but like to say like, is, being at one extreme of that, like I have whatever, five prefectures in this province versus 40, or versus, the peak at whatever it was, 27 or something, like how steep is that relative to, like, is that like one more protest a year out of 10, or is that like the difference between having protests and not having protests? Like how big of an effect is this? What's kind of the magnitude, the substantive magnitude that you're getting from your estimates?
Okay.
But in terms of visualizing that, I would make figure 1 aggregated the way that figure 4 is, right? Because like a whole bunch of dots I mean, I see that they're spread apart, but if you then aggregate it and color code it like figure 4, you also at the same time convey something about the intensity by province as well. So I think you could just get a little more information there.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good one. Thank you. Yeah.
Cool. And Zach had one more point about data that you should probably say out loud.
Yeah. So I know Jennifer Pan is generating protest data in China, and she's not using newspapers. I don't know if she's classifying the kind of protest, but it might just be worth shooting her an email and seeing if she has protest data that you could use that then might get you more variation on intensity and geographic variation.
She's not using newspaper. What kind of source? Do you know? Like I
actually think it's Weibo.
Okay.
And I've seen a quick presentation of it, but I couldn't tell you more about it. Yeah, she's at Stanford Communication.
Yeah.
Then really quickly, I think we still have 2 minutes. I found the images and figures very hard to read. And at first I thought it was my printout, but I'm looking at your PDF, and they're kind of blurry and small. So they need to be bigger and sharper.
Yeah.
Especially the regression, right?
Yeah.
I probably just toss this coefficient plots. Some people told me that they're old-fashioned. They want to see coefficient table.
No, the forest plots are good. No, I would keep that. Yeah, no, it's a good figure. I would just make them take up like a whole page, 75% of the page.
Use bigger font.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would not use a table. I would keep the forest plots.
Okay.
Yeah. You can also, output, you can specify the resolution when you generate the image. So just make it a higher resolution. So when you blow it up, it's not blurry. Yeah. Now the figures are good stylistically. They're just a little hard to read.
Right.
Cool. Well, I'd like to thank Howard for sharing his work with us today and remind anybody who's watching that you can go back and watch it again. You could see the presentation over and over again. That's the beauty of the internet. You can also find the paper on our website and contact Howard directly if you have any comments or questions about this work. I'd like to thank you very much, Peter Lorentzen and Zachary Steinert-Threlkeld for joining us today and reading this paper carefully and giving us excellent comments. So I hope we see this paper in publication soon. Our next meeting is next Monday, April 2nd, and June Koga will be presenting on coups, I believe, some sort of coups and repression. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.